welcome to this edition of Talking Europe. The threat of terrorism, regular strikes and plain old bad weather saw many EU countries record a drop in tourists over the summer season. France is generally one of the most visited in the EU. It attracted more than 84 million tourists last year, and expectations were high that those figures would not only be matched but surpassed. However, statistics suggest that France is becoming a less popular place today. Paris saw a 15% fall in the number of visitors for the first half of the year, and recent figures estimate a €750 million drop in the region's revenue. On the flip side, however, Spain's tourism ministry reported a 12% spike in arrivals from January to June, while EU's poorest member Bulgaria is also doing well and attracting more tourists than ever before. So tourists are moving elsewhere, but what about other economic interests? Could current crises see businesses also turn away? What can governments do to bring people back? With us to give us their insights, we have Mr. István Ujhely, Hungarian MEP and President of the Tourism Commission here at the EU Parliament. At the other side of the table, we have Mr. Dominique Riquet, a French MEP, also on that Tourism Commission and from one of the countries suffering from those terrorist attacks, and also from the European Tourism Commission, a grouping really of national tourist boards aiming to promote the European tourism. We have Mr. Peter de Wilde, you're the CEO of the Tourism Office for Flanders here in Belgium. Thanks all for being with us. Can I just start, perhaps Mr. Ujhely, with your good self? Do you think, in general, people have turned away from the EU? Tourists have turned away? And why?
We have to learn that the tourism and the travel sector is one of the most resilient sector. When I have any kinds of speech here, my first sentence is, the tourism is industry of peace. And, I have to tell you one very interesting data features. In 1950, there were only 25 million tourists all over the world. In 2000, there were 700 million tourists all over the world. And now we have more than 1.2 billion tourists. So here for us in the European Union, is one of the most important sector. We have more than 25 million jobs which depends of the tourism. So that's why all those terrorist attacks were very, very big problems for the European society and for the European tourism. That's why we need common programs, supports for the European tourism.
To make people feel safer again. Monsieur Riquet, coming from France, which was hit by multiple terrorist attacks, how do you see the tourism? Did it resist? Paris certainly didn't.
It's probably very difficult because we have a decrease of the figure of the percentage of tourism, around 10%, I think, around. But I think that it was not a single cause, because when you are looking for what is the matter of the crisis for the terrorism, you have four topics: environmental, sanitary crisis, terrorism, and also political and social quiet. And if you look for France, for example, suddenly we have 2 or 3 big terrorist attacks in France, but also a lot of social movement, strike and violence. And I think it's also something very important for that. We see that we have a lot of decrease in the frequentation of tourism. But I think it's several causes possible.
Okay, well, let's look at those several causes in just a few minutes. But first, let's take a quick reminder of how the summer went in Paris and listen to a few of the tourists that did make it over. Laurent Bersteker reports.
Last year, Paris received over 47 million tourists. But the summer of 2016 has seen a much quieter city.
There was very less people. So I asked my husband, I was like, what's going on? When we came here in 2012, there was so many people.
I'm a tourist. I want the empty streets for the picture. So Montmartre is beautiful like this.
At high season, this square in Montmartre is normally packed with people, but many visitors say they were reluctant to come after the terror attacks across France.
I was thinking about, as I was traveling in the tube, what if somebody planted a bomb?
This museum used to be the studio of renowned painter Renoir. Employees here say it's the first time they've seen so few visitors.
There's been a drop in European tourists, about 11%, and we've also seen 50% fewer foreign tourists between July and August.
Businesses on the famous Champs-Élysées also say they're suffering from the drop in American, Emirati and Japanese visitors. Franck Blanchard has run his stall selling Paris-themed souvenirs and newspapers for many years.
We work with hotels, and the hotels are definitely ordering fewer newspapers for their guests.
Hotels have seen their bookings drop by 10% since July. The biggest losses are at the luxury end of the scale.
There's been a drop in reservations, but also a rise in cancellations. Those started happening after the tragic events in Nice on the 14th of July.
Terrorism is only one factor, with the drop in the pound after Brexit and strikes also blamed for the fall in tourism.
So we've seen there, people still did come to Paris, but slightly more uneasy, really. You know, tourists there saying in the metro, they're still conscious that they are holidaying in an area that was susceptible to attacks. Mr. de Wilde, overall, do you think it has a lasting impact, these kind of terrorist attacks?
Well, I tend to agree with my neighbor here that tourism is very resilient industry. But we also see in the figures that the reaction of customers in tourism also has a marked evolution. It took, after the New York attacks, it took New York 36 months to recover. After the London and the Madrid attacks, it was already down to 12 to 14 months. And we still see, we can feel now in Belgium, who was affected too, we can already feel after summer now that things are picking up again.
Mr. Wihey, do you think, governments need to do more to address this situation? You know, how safe do you think people feel the EU is today? What needs to be done to re-stimulate that growth? Mr. Riquet as well, the same question.
It was a very difficult question because, of course, we have to realize how the European Union works. Of course, for example, big cities like Paris or Brussels can solve some problems alone to make big support for the tourism and to strong the security systems. And also the national level is very important, how the governments can control everything and can support the tourism agencies and small businesses. But the big question for me, how and what we can do here in the European level. Because we have to realize that we have a big global competition. That's why when the third countries, travelers, for example, from China or from the United States, decide the next year plan, family tourism, vacation plans, then maybe they will cancel the travels to Europe. And if we had problems in Brussels or in Paris or anywhere else, then the Chinese travelers decide to go out from Europe and not to the Europe.
But the situation, of course, as you say, for the long-haul markets is markedly different from the situation for people living in Europe.
Of course.
Knowing the situation in Europe, knowing that when something happens in Paris or in Brussels, it's not all
That's
over
why Italy
Europe.
won this summer, and Bulgaria
Spain,
and Budapest, for example.
And a lot of other countries. Yeah. Holland did very good. So there's a lot of things to be said for facilitating intra-European travel even more than we are doing today. Instead of building walls, we made a study on this topic, and visa facilitation for safe countries can bring us millions of jobs.
Mr. Riquet, do you agree that perhaps the EU should look more as a bloc at the tourism sector rather than nationally, and perhaps, you know...
It's a general feeling of trust in safety, you know. Yeah. It's general.
Exactly.
But for example, for the China tourism, is not the more important problem is not the terrorism attack, but is a serious security on the street.
Indeed, let's look at this, because is this not nearly more of a problem for France? I mean, renowned for strikes. There was even an association, Airlines for Europe, did a study and said the EU GDP lost something like 9.5 billion over the last 5 years due to strikes, most of them happening in France. So, I mean, is it not shooting ourselves in the foot?
Let's talk about jobs.
I agree with that.
Let's talk about jobs. Every bad news about Europe, it means we lost some jobs in the tourism sector.
But every bad story, because certainly the terrorist attacks seem to have had an effect. EU tourism still growing, but much less than we hoped and going in new directions. But when you look at the refugee crisis, Greece did pretty good in tourism this summer, did it not, Mr. de Wilde?
It did. And, but it tends to show that some of the problems who are playing at European frontiers have an effect on regions that you cannot calculate in a mathematical way. And when you speak about tourism and you speak about effects and security, we cannot stress enough that Europe is still the safest travel destination by far in the world. It attracts more than 50% of all worldwide travelers come to Europe, more than 50%.
Just while we have you, Mr. Wihey, I mean, the refugee crisis is one that Europe hasn't put to bed yet. There's going to be a referendum in your home country, Hungary, on the 2nd of October. How do you think that's going to go? Do you think the EU will finally move towards a solution, or could we be looking for more trouble ahead?
Oh, I think it's not the same topic now. And, you know, at home in Hungary, I'm an opposition politician.
Socialist Party,
I'm
indeed.
from the Socialist Party. So we have a very, very bad feeling with this referendum, which is, I think, not about the refugees. It's about the European Union and the Hungarian connection. That's why we told to our voters not to go to vote, to stay at home and to stay in the European Union, but to go back to the tourism. For example, Budapest also was a winner in the last 2 years. All the hotels in Budapest were full with European visitors, tourists.
Well, let's look at because it does seem the security question is a big one when it comes to tourism. So what should the EU do? There's a lot of talk now since the UK voted to leave, even though it hasn't yet started that process of leaving, about an EU army, about more common EU security. Do you think that's a good idea, Mr. Riquet?
Oh, yes, I think it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah,
it's early for us, because I think it's going forward with not only with the tourism topic, but with economic topic about that, general economic topic about that. But I think it's a huge problem, a huge concern for us. Yes.
Would you think that would help, Mr. de Wilde, to have this common...
Every common effort to make stronger the European Union as a whole and to increase our values and the way we live them is a good one. But we need to keep in mind, and specifically for tourism, that diversity within Europe is our biggest asset, is our biggest selling point. So I'm agreeing with more unity, more strength together, but we need to make sure that we keep and safeguard our diversity.
Unity is not uniformity.
No, exactly.
That's true.
One more thing, because we all have this paper, which is the manifesto for tourism, for growth and jobs here in Europe. And the ETC was one of the main organizers who created, together with us, with politicians, one big round table here in the European Union, together with the tourism stakeholders and politicians from the Commission or the European Parliament. Because we realized that we need stronger support for the European tourism.
What kind of support does it get? Like, give me the figures. How much GDP does it represent tourism, and what kind of support?
It's nearly 10%
of the EU GDP.
Let's say it's
millions of jobs.
25, 26 million jobs in Europe.
Direct jobs or
direct jobs. So this means I think it's the third most important industry in Europe.
Exactly.
There's discussion. Yeah.
There's discussion on the figures, and there shouldn't be any discussion on the figures. We need to be in the clear about that. Every national organization is clear about its figures.
It's not such a big industry.
What is absolutely sure that it's probably for the future, it's a topic of growth, yes. Because it's more difficult to know how industry and some services will grow. But about tourism, everybody knows that it will grow.
At the same time, is it not hard being part of the European Union? Because in a way, the EU countries are competing against each other, and yet we need some kind of Union to bring people into the EU in the first place. How do we make this balance, Mr. Lee?
There is the domestic travel, of course, in Europe, which is still accountable for the biggest part of our tourism.
But what does it mean, domestic?
Domestic means...
Domestic, it means only
for me,
in one country.
Means
Europe.
In Europe. So the domestic travel in Europe means that we need to consider each other as competitors, but we need to be aware that we have to be clever about competing and not competing on the long-haul markets where Europe is perceived as a destination. There we should work together and we should find each other. And even then, in developing regions in Europe, we need to make sure, and that's one of the big issues, that the development budgets for the regions, for example, are put into place so that they are promotable, also on the long haul.
Yeah, and visible. Very briefly, just to get a quick roundtable opinion, Brexit effect on tourism? Once the UK steps away, will that have a knock-on effect on the EU tourism, and a bad one?
I think it will have an effect on short term. I'm not sure on the long term.
Good to know.
Short term, very serious effects. For example, in Budapest, and if we think about the low budget airplane companies, there will be very serious effects for them.
Okay, Mr. Riquet, France, the UK, very close.
We have seen an effect because the pound falls and the tourism increase in Great Britain. But I think it is at the margin. I think it will be not very durable and important.
Okay. So overall, tourism is the one industry and sector that we can get behind and that will stay positive.
And it will guarantee growth.
There you go.
Yes. What is something serious? Is not entertainment.
There you go. We'll end on that positive note. Thanks indeed to all my guests for having joined us. Thanks also to you at home for having watched. This brings us to the end of this half of Talking Europe. See you again after the news.